Why are polls wrong? In every election, people want to know, are pollsters finally going to get it right this time, or will they be wrong again? In today's episode of Discussion Points, we're going to tell you about two categories of problems that we're seeing in polling today and what you need to watch out for in the elections for Congress coming up this fall. Welcome to Discussion Points. I'm Myra Miller, the co-founder of the Winston Group, and I'm joined today by David Winston, the president of the Winston Group. From the Real Clear Politics poll postings, which is a well-known source for polling, the range of recent results for the House Congressional Generic Ballot favors Democrats by 2 up to plus 10 for Democrats. So two very different outcomes. It could be a very tight race for the House or a landslide, which is it. So clearly some polls are generally accurate, others not so much. So it's not that all polls are wrong, but some clearly are. How do you know which ones to trust? David, let's talk about the first category of what we're seeing in polling today with problems. And it's actually not so much about the methodology as it is the motivation behind the poll.
Yeah, and what you're seeing in a lot of cases is surveys being used to validate a narrative or a point of view. And a simple example of that is some bill is on the floor of the House, and you'll see somebody come on with a survey that says, and here are the two reasons that people are really unhappy with this bill, which is why they oppose it so much. And you'll go to potentially another cable show and say, hey, we just got this survey, and here are the two reasons why people really like this bill, which is why they support it so much. And so you have this dynamic, okay, do they support it or oppose it? And clearly what's occurring here is it's simply just a validation of the narrative and the point of view. And what this really is a public relations exercise as opposed to a public opinion exercise. And the whole point is to drive advocacy, an advocacy goal or a particular narrative in that public relations context.
And we're seeing more and more of that in Washington these days. And then on the campaign side, we see so many times, especially toward the end of the election cycle around October, late October, a poll coming out for a campaign to say the race is closing. We want donors to put money in and they want to show, hey, this race is really close. And then election night, the race will not even be close. Maybe the candidate will lose by double-digit margins. But clearly that poll was put out last minute to try to get people to contribute money, but then people move on from it and there's no accountability.
No, and you're defining another purpose that we're seeing on a very frequent basis is candidates and campaigns that are struggling do a survey that shows, in fact, here's the way they can be competitive so they can fundraise. And so polling, not so much for campaign strategy, but to help the campaign raise money and fundraise. And that's a very, very different purpose.
Mm-hmm. Well, how can you tell if numbers are just trying to validate a point of view or a narrative? And I would say the first indicator of a poll like that is when every data point in polling memo is favorable to one side, whether it's an agenda, a policy, or the sponsor of the poll. If every point in the polling memo is favorable to one side, that's a pretty good indicator that this is a poll geared toward validating a narrative.
Yeah, and within that, again, that dynamic of every single point sort of lines up. It ends up sounding like it's a press release more so than a survey analysis. And suddenly, here are the 5 things that are awesome about this, and there's nothing that can challenge that. And quite frankly, look, even the best arguments, there's something that can be said in terms of a different direction. And here's the thing: members, elected officials, and their staffs, and the media know that's the case. Nothing is perfect. And so when they see something like that, naturally they take a view of it in terms of, I know what's occurring here. I'm just being sold a point of view and a narrative as opposed to trying to get a real understanding of where the electorate's at. Now, having said that, part of the challenge is the PR firms that are driving that or the particular group driving that don't want to interject what problems could exist. But the bottom line is, to some degree, to get people to buy the veracity of the survey, there's got to be an understanding that there are balancing elements, although it can be balanced strongly in one direction.
Another indicator of a poll like this is if there are obvious numbers that are missing or hidden. So, for instance, if the poll, like in the campaign context, makes a big deal about the negative brand image of the opponent, yet it doesn't mention the brand image of the candidate who's paying for the survey, that's a pretty good sign that the brand image of the candidate is probably not good, because anytime there are numbers that are hidden or they're missing, that means that those numbers aren't good.
And again, this gets to the key point here in terms of when you're presenting information that in fact there's context to it. And
Mhm.
so what you're defining is, yes, okay, so this person's fave unfave is particularly bad, but nothing else is mentioned. The challenge here is, okay, so that person isn't well liked, but what am I supposed to do with that as a standalone piece of information? Because again, particularly when you're looking at campaigns, there's a choice involved. And so, yes, you're saying that this person may be not exactly particularly well liked, but what about the other person as the context for that? And the electorate is smart enough to recognize that that's what's occurring.
People know when they're being spun. All right, David, it reminds me of the joke you like to tell about the partial score. So tell us a joke.
Yeah, and it was George Carlin, and he would play this sportscaster personality on TV, and his line here was, "I have a partial score in Pittsburgh 7," and obviously there's no context to that 7, right? If the other team has got 0, 7's good. If the other team has got 28, then 7's bad. But if you just have this standalone number, what exactly does it mean? So it's not just simply it's a partial score; it's a score that has no
Yeah.
context, and
So
so part of
these polls that just validate these one-sided polls that try to validate these narratives are like the partial score.
Yeah, because what they're not giving you any context for that particular number. And again,
Right.
going back to what I was describing at the beginning in terms of here are the 2 points why the 2 things that people don't like about this bill, which is why they don't like it. Well, that should pretty much tell you that that's what the focus was, but you didn't give the other side.
Mhm.
And so that is a real important dynamic that people need to recognize is if they're not listen for there are going to be plus and minuses in virtually any policy discussion. Are you hearing those? And if you're not, then what you're getting is a press release and an advocacy for a narrative as opposed to a clear understanding of what that dynamic of that issue is.
Right. And given the rise of these PR type polls to push a narrative, there can be pressure put on a polling organization, a pollster to produce a certain result. And people like to be told what they want to hear in many cases. And we see plenty of people, purveyors of data nowadays that are willing to provide that. You and I have been in situations where we found that it's a lot more fun to go in and tell people that they're winning, and it's not as much fun to tell people that they're losing or in difficult situations, but you have to do it. You have to be honest with your audience because if you don't, it's a real disservice to that audience.
Now, and the thing is, you have individuals who are pushing for a point of view, who are willing to fund a survey, and they come in and say, "Here are the 12 questions we want you to ask, and we want you to just ask it this way." And really, they're doing themselves a disservice, and the pollsters are doing them a disservice in terms of let's put this
Mhm.
together in such a way that people looking at what you're presenting think that you were thorough in terms of looking at the entire situation. But in a lot of cases, that's not the direction that that person is focused on. What they're focused on is they want to drive a narrative or a point of view.
Well, we've seen both parties get burned by polling recently. Happened to Republicans in 2022, where a number of conservative driven polls, some media polls were forecasting a landslide, a big red wave that didn't happen. Republicans were very shocked by that. In 2020, Democrats and many media organizations were forecasting a blue wave landslide. While President Biden did win by a healthy margin, Democrats came very close to losing the House because their polling was bad. So it's really causing problems on both sides. So why do you think we're seeing some pollsters getting things so wrong and yet nothing seems to change?
Because what basically happens after an election and it doesn't go the way people thought it was going to go, there's a month, 2 month period where people go, okay, what happened? Why didn't we get this right or
A lot
wrong?
of
And they
soul
begin,
searching.
yes, lots of soul searching. We know we ran a good campaign, but and what it basically happens at this point, they go through about a 2, maybe 3 month process, beginning to think through it, but then everybody begins to move on to the next election
Mhm.
because there are things they got to start the fundraising process, they got to start recruiting candidates,
Yeah.
and there's never that real thorough review of what happened. And the best example of that recently is this DNC autopsy report, where
Mhm.
I mean, there was virtually no survey data described in this outside of like a couple of governors' races of all things throughout the country. And as a result, what happens is you can't learn the lessons that you need out of the particular election because everybody just moves on to the next thing and they never really go back and understand what happened.
Mhm.
And that's what happens. And so it's not that people don't want to be make individuals accountable for that, but they just move on to the next thing before they get a chance to really have that sort of thorough review.
Washington has a very short-term memory, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Well, let's
and the other problem too is, truth be told, what they're you have all these crises pop up, and so these sort of short-term crises pop up, and everybody stops and focuses on those. And by the time you begin to move through a bunch of those, people are just not going to say, "Oh, well, that was the last election. We don't want to talk about that." And the best example, again, the one excuse in terms of the autopsy report was, "Well, we know why she lost. She got in too late, and because of Biden." Uh, and then of course there was the economy, and it's sort of like, well, that's not really an explanation. That's a sequence of things that might be occurring, but why were they impacting people, and how were they impacting people, which is potentially more
yeah.
important.
Well, let's turn to the second category of polling problems related to methodology. We've seen the transition from landline phones to cell. Many pollsters are doing more with online. So talk a bit about what's happening there.
Well, you've seen this huge transition in terms of the way public opinion interviews are gathered. Again, if you
Mhm.
go back to the 80s and 90s of the last century, it was all done on phone landlines. Well, I mean, those are clearly disappearing. And now it's all cell phones and online. And cell phones, you have the dynamic that people, if you're not on the contact list, they don't take the call. And online, it's they recruit people who are willing to do surveys. Well, the thing about doing landlines is you could do what is known as random digit dialing, which means everybody in the country had a chance in theory to be a part of the sample. What you're talking about now with both cell phones and from online is that probability doesn't exist. It's called non-random sampling, not surprisingly. And what that means is that you get these interviews in, and you're going to have to weight them in such a way that it reflects the actual population or universe of who you're
Mhm.
trying to interview. And weighting means this, and here's a simple example. At the national level, generally 52% of the electorate are women, 48% are men. So when you do your national sample, you want to make sure that that's seen in the sample, 52% being women, 48% being men. But you're doing it across a variety of different additional categories, whether that be party identification,
Mhm.
ideology, age, race, a variety of things. And so you
Mhm.
put together these weights to reflect what the universe looks like. And so I think what people need to realize is when they're looking at surveys, they're not simply looking at the questions that were put together, but the weighting methodology and thought process that whoever did the survey has. And if that's not clear, which is why you can potentially get, again, very, very different results. If that's not clear and understanding when you're looking at the survey and the demographics of that survey, then it's going to be just very hard to evaluate what in fact you're looking at.
Right. And the pollster needs to have a very clear, thorough understanding of the vote history of a district or a state to be able to formulate that weighting approach.
And some of the best examples when you're looking at particularly statewide or national level is you've got exit polls where you had 20,000 interviews nationally. And so
Mhm.
you have a good reasonable estimate in terms of what a lot of those numbers should look like. Some people want to look at those, some people don't. They just want to do like likely voter screens and assume that, well, that'll take care of it. But the bottom line is when you are looking at someone who defines themselves as doing public opinion research, one thing that they're actually bringing at this point to the process is, in fact, their understanding of how to do effective weighting to represent universes, populations that they're going to be interviewing.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the red flags that people need to watch out for in polls that are going to be coming out this fall. We're going to be seeing just an avalanche of campaign polls, particularly as we go into the fall. I would say one of the big ones is if no demographics are available for a survey, then there's no way to really evaluate the weighting approach. So always making
And
sure the demographics are available.
no, and that's absolutely essential. And let's go back to the dynamic that you laid out in terms of here's the survey where it was +2 for Democrats. So it was a very competitive situation versus +10 for Democrats, which means there was basically going to be a wave election for the Democrats. Interesting dynamic. But let's say that +10, that the party identification within that survey, national level survey, favored Democrats by 15 points, whereas the other survey had it favoring one party or the other by 1 or 2 points. Well, it's obvious what's driving that separation is not people behaving differently. It's that one survey clearly was going to show Democrats leading because it was plus 15 party identification, and the other one being within 1 or 2 was going to show potentially a more competitive situation. So the difference there isn't people's attitudes. The difference is just simply the weighting that occurred that allowed that distinction. And that's why people need to be able to see the demographics so they can see what's behind the survey in terms
Right.
of who's been interviewed. And
Mhm.
from that, then draw a conclusion in terms of how much they think that reflects what is actually occurring.
Right. And if that entity refuses to release demographics, then that should raise some real concerns. I would say another red flag that people should look out for is if you see an outlier poll that has a particular result that is out of alignment with what other polls are showing, should give some caution to that, because that's not to say that all the polls have to show the same result, but there should be some independent verification of an outlier poll if it's showing an unusual result.
And there are going to be outliers, right? I mean, because again,
Mhm.
statistically, that is a clear possibility. But the other thing too is, again, going back to what you were talking about, is you want to have an understanding of some of those national numbers. But just as the example, if you see a party that has a 12-point party ID advantage, and like the largest we've seen recently has been +7 for a party, and now we're looking at a +12. The immediate question is, why is this so much larger than the biggest example
Right.
that we've seen, right? And if the whoever did the survey can explain that, okay, fine. But a lot of times you don't even know that difference exists because they're not showing you the data to be able to get to that.
Right. Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for this fall, and hopefully, the more people can become informed about what they need to be looking for, there can be more accountability in polling that's coming out. So, we're going to leave it this week. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Be sure to check out our website for more resources at winstongroup.net. We'll be back next week. Stay tuned for more discussion points.